nothing in my talk that relates to that, but in fact everything. Because, you know, it is essential to recognize, as has been mentioned, you know, that what is happening in Venezuela has specific, unique national roots. That it's not an abstract revolutionary process, that it draws upon national heroes, national figures, people who are influential in Latin America, and that is a characteristic that I think is essential. And it's one of the things I talked about in a speech I'd given a few years ago in Venezuela, which is part of the book building now, called "Socialism Does Not Drop from the Sky." It doesn't drop from the sky because it's always rooted in particular societies, and this is a precise example of what you have to understand about that. It was mentioned that I had, you know, come from Caracas. Actually, I did come from Caracas, but it wasn't for this trip specifically. This is actually a whistle stop en route to Vancouver, which I arrived 5 o'clock this morning, and I'll go out on the 10 o'clock plane tonight. The effect of this will, in part, be that I may become relatively exhausted. Probably not, you know, during the talk or during the question period, because the adrenaline will be high. I'll collapse immediately after. But I noticed in looking over...
many years to bribe them to do this.
I noticed in looking over the notes I jotted down this morning, you know, this is the only time I had to work on this actually, that one of the indications of my you know, lack of sleep, etc., like that, is that I can't read my writing. But anyway, I'm going to try and you know, give an overall picture, and I think that much of this will be, you know, best developed through the process of questions and answers, because I'm sure people have many questions about Venezuela, and I would try to, you know, answer them as best as I could. The first question, though, I want to explore relates to the title of this talk. Which is Venezuela Building Socialism for the 21st Century. And there's an immediate begged question there. What's socialism for the 21st century? What do we mean by that? And I think it's important to recognize that there is no text on socialism for the 21st century. I've tried to set out some ideas and build it now in some of my other articles. There was an article in Month Review in the April issue called New Wings for Socialism, and then I've got another one in the July-August special issue on Venezuela and Latin America in Monthly Review. But at best, all I can do is sort of point in the general direction, no specifics. So because what is characteristic of what's happening in Venezuela, and I think in general on this whole question of socialism for the 21st century, is what people say is the process of making the path as we go. But there are some characteristics, I think, that are becoming clear, and that is what socialism for the 21st century is not. And certainly it is not, you know, in anyone's conception, a centrally planned or more specifically directed economy from above, which is controlled by a vanguard party which acts as if it can control, but in fact can't. It's not that kind of process brings with it alienated workers who don't care what they produce as long as they get paid at the end of the week or the end of the month. And with enterprise managers who are in fact income maximizers who, you know, do whatever they can to maximize their income, and as we see in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and in China, emerge subsequently as the new capitalist class. So it's not that. That's not socialism for the 21st century. Nor is it the system which purported to be an alternative socialism because of its focus on a very central element that every socialism must have, which is worker management. The system of self-management in Yugoslavia, where self-management occurred through the market and where there was significant solidarity within the workplaces, but on the other hand, you know, a general lack of solidarity within society, and in fact the emergence of a new productive relation, which was group ownership, which became increasingly, you know, in conflict with the interests of society, where, in fact, all that mattered in Yugoslavia was the growth of income. Now, both those models, which characterized the 20th century, had a common element, and that was the element which emphasized the growth of productive forces. Not only the growth of productive forces, but also the idea that socialism is a separate stage as unique from a higher, better stage, And in this separate stage, the emphasis had to be on self-interest, on getting back in accordance with what you produce. Distribution in relationship to contribution. The quid pro quo. I give you this, you give me that. I get back what I return. That kind of exchange transaction. The idea that there was a separate stage of socialism, unique with its own characteristics, goes back to an interpretation of Marx, an interpretation of Marx's Gotha program, one of the few places where he wrote explicitly about socialism, except for the Grundriss, which is a very rich document, but was not very well known. This idea of two separate stages was in fact an interpretation of Marx's Gotha program by Lenin. And I suggest it was a grievous misinterpretation, because it was never Marx's position that there were two separate stages. Rather, Marx talked about a process of development, a process in which you begin with a society which is inevitably defective. The new society is inevitably defective because it's infected by the old society. It's marked economically, socially, morally, intellectually by the birthmarks of the society from which it emerged. And Marx's argument was the society which emerges has defects, and it develops its own logic. It subordinates those defects. It increasingly, by developing its own logic, builds then upon its own foundations. That's the distinction he makes in the Gotha program between the society as it emerges from capitalism and as it develops on its own foundation. The idea of distribution in accordance with contribution was clearly for Marx a defect. It was a defect of the old society. It was the result of people who were marked and infected by the old society. And for Marx, the very concept of this was it was necessary to subordinate these defects, to struggle against the defects, because in fact, as we've seen, we can see it theoretically, but we can certainly see it in practice, building on the defects, building on self-interest, leads you back to capitalism. Now, that's not a great insight on my part, although I wrote a paper about this and presented in Cuba last year, and which will be published in Science and Society in the next issue. It's Che Guevara's insight. Che's made the point that when you try to build on the old mechanisms that you borrow from capitalism, you inevitably end up in a blind alley. And you don't know where you took the wrong turn, but you're in a blind alley because you have undermined consciousness through this process. And he argued, to build a new society, you have to simultaneously build new human beings. You have to build new socialist human beings. When we talk about socialism for the 21st century, we're talking about these ideas of Che, which are not highly developed, but nevertheless instinctively pointed in the right direction. In other words, pointing in a different direction to the direction which is that of emphasizing self-interest. Rather than focus on self-interest, rather than focus on a quid pro quo, the focus is on building solidarity. The focus is on building and creating new social norms based upon cooperation and on concepts of solidarity. And in that process, you go different ways. You focus on the battle of ideas becomes essential. The ideological struggle becomes essential. But so also is actual practice. The actual process of creating new forms of cooperation. The concept that Marx introduced, the concept of revolutionary practice, is the simultaneous changing of circumstances and self-change. And that is precisely what is part of this process as well, a process of creating the conditions in which people develop through their own activity, where they develop human capacities through their activities, and they end by this process of their own activity, what Marx referred to in capitalism as the crippling of body and mind of the worker, because you end the necessity of ending the division between thinking and doing. In other words, the alternative focus is on human development. And in that respect, I would suggest that the concept of socialism for the 21st century is really not only a return to the ideas of Che, but also a return to Marx's ideas, where he talks about the importance of a society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And I would argue that that's what the process in Venezuela is all about. Hugo Chavez, at the World Social Forum in 2005, made the statement, we have to reinvent socialism. It can't be the kind of socialism we saw in the Soviet Union, but it will emerge as we develop new systems that are built upon cooperation, not competition. We must, he continued, we must reclaim socialism as a thesis, a project, and a path, but a new type of socialism, a humanist one, where human beings and not machines in the state, which put human beings and not machines in the state ahead of everything. These ideas are present in the Bolivarian Constitution, a remarkable constitution to read for some of its themes. Because in that constitution it stresses that the overall goal is full, complete human development, developing the full potential of every human being. And it's not simply that explicit emphasis on human development, which you can find in about 4 different articles of the Constitution, keep coming up. And it's always been a mystery who put these in there. But it's not only that; it's also the very clear and explicit recognition that this happens only through practice, only through participation, only through protagonism. And they constantly talk about a protagonist society, which is to say, a society in which human beings are subjects. And that is, a very clear emphasis there. The idea, and it's explicitly, the Constitution says, that, protagonism and participation in things like self-government, self-management, local democracy is necessary for the people's complete development, both collective and individual, or both individual and collective. So that's an important element in the Constitution. The emphasis on human development, the emphasis on revolutionary practice, that people only transform themselves through their own activity. And I referred to that actually in the next monthly review article as the subversive element in the Bolivarian Constitution. Because you have to recognize the Bolivarian Constitution is effectively a capitalist constitution. It contains support for private initiative, private industry. It gave independence to the central bank, and it emphasized basically the state fostering the private sector, the private initiative. And in fact, the first economic plan for Venezuela, a plan for 2001 to 2007, had a state sector, very clear state sector that would be active. It was, in that respect, a rejection of neoliberalism. It talked about the importance, though, of the state building trust for foreign and domestic investors, creating an environment which built trust for them. And it also included a social economy as an alternative and complement. But the social economy that they talked about was really kind of minuscule. It was there, but in the plan, but it wasn't a major element. It was basically providing support through a number of institutions like microcredits, the Women's Development Bank, etc., for the development of cooperatives. And these cooperatives were really to be drawing people out of the informal sector. And you have to understand that the informal sector contains 50% of the working class in Venezuela. Not unique, in this respect of many, countries of the South which have had that effect as a result of neoliberalism and capitalist restructuring. So you have, that, situation of very large numbers of the poor who are in the informal sector, who are really what one would have to call the reserve army of the unemployed, who are just making do, by any mechanism of survival that they can, but who really would like to have a formal job with, with some protection, for pensions, etc., like that. Some would like to stay independent, but most would like to have, that job. Well, the social economy, the conception of the social economy in that first, plan, 2001 to 2007, said we have to help these people, we have to move these people and build up an emergent managerial class. To move them into cooperatives. It was to, create this managerial class out of the informal sector. So what were they talking about? They were talking about capitalism. a different kind of capitalism. It was certainly a rejection of neoliberalism, certainly a rejection of the market should rule everything. It was that there should be an active state, and the state should intervene, the state should do something about poverty, it should do something about many things, but it was still a different kind of capitalism. And in fact, I've suggested I guess it was in the last chapter in Build It Now, that its model was really the South Korean and South Asian model, an active state capital, as fostering capitalism. Well, they began to act on these things, doing little things like, law and cooperatives. Chavez, insisted on the incorporation of these changes. This is after his election, after the Constitution, and one of the most inflammatory bills of all, which was the Hydrocarbon Act, which would ensure that new oil ventures would have, some significant royalties, maybe 30%, I think it was, as opposed to the 2% or so that the existing ones had. There were, a whole series of acts that Chavez was introducing in 2002, which, created enormous problems. It created, a very strong opposition response. A split in the Chavez's own coalition, which was an electoral coalition filled with many opportunists who left at that point when they realized that Chavez really meant to introduce some of the promises that he had made, how unusual, and so they were, they said, we're out of here. And then also the oligarchy of the period, of that period, saying, well, this is, serious. I mean, if he's going to do something about these things, maybe he's going to really, move on a number of other things. Every measure, the 47 laws that Chavez moved on in 2002, were completely consistent with capitalism. It wasn't what was introduced, it was the response to it that was critical. That a pampered oligarchy, which has lived, in a parasitic way off the oil rents, as much of Venezuela has, not much, but a very significant portion of Venezuela has, rent seekers who find any possible way, to get, their hands on oil money. I'll come back to this question. That this, there was an enormous rejection of these measures, and so you have a coup, supported by the United States, led, by local, oligarchy in conjunction with the military, etc. Well, that coup we all know is defeated. Don't have to talk about that. That's followed, and Chavez initially, sort of didn't know his strength, and so he was very conciliatory. He was conciliatory in his appointment of new economic ministers, and in how he moved. He didn't know how much of the strength he had was, in the army, was simply people who rejected some of the measures of the golpistas, or whether it was a rejection, or whether these were in fact people who were committed to real change. So he was very careful initially, but in that period, the oligarchy made its next move, and its next move was really the key that they had was to shut down oil, shut down the oil industry. They did this beginning in early December of 2002, and this was part of a whole general lockout. In which a number of industries participated, and they expected that Chavez would be gone before Christmas, that it could not possibly last. They did not anticipate, that the blue-collar workers at PDVSA would keep it going, that the army would join in to keep it going, that people would organize in the streets, etc., to maintain gasoline distribution, that there would be a whole series of processes in which people would develop in defense of what was happening. In defense of the government, and I argue, and I think that it's pretty clear that it's that period, that fighting the bosses' lockout from December 2002 to in the early spring, which was more significant than the defeating the coup, because it's that long period of developing significant consciousness on the part of workers and people in the community that was absolutely critical. So there were really two gifts that were given to the revolution in this process. One, the coup, which unmasked the enemies in the army, etc. And then after the oil strike, the abandonment effectively of their area of strength, which was the oil company, because all of those plotters were gone. And then now the oil company belonged to the state. The state within the state was no more after that defeat. And so those were two gifts. And then the third gift that came was the referendum campaign against the government to recall Chavez. A unique characteristic of the Venezuelan constitution is that every office holder can be recalled halfway through their term. And there's a long process going on right now in which many mayors are being subjected to revocation recalled. Referendum. The referendums haven't started yet because they're now gathering the signatures, but it's there. So that process began, and I should tell you that as that particular process began, many Chavez, party leaders of the various parties all said, well, they'll never get the signatures, they'll never get enough to do this, and there was this grand competition between the leaders of the various Chavez parties, the Quinta Republica Party, which was the party that the electoral party Chavez himself had formed, but some of the other parties, the PPT and the Podemos, they would, all their leaders would get up, all men, and make macho speeches about how they were going to crush the opposition would not get any signatures, etc., like that. Well, the opposition got the signatures, and of course, what was the response of these party leaders was, it's fraud, it's a mega fraud. They don't have the signatures, it's a lie, etc., and their advice to Chavez was, ignore it, reject it, etc., which of course would have been an absolute disaster. Chavez, who has fantastic instincts, responded in a quite different way. Chavez said, rejected the organizing committee that he had, which was called the Comando Ayacucho, which had been supposedly fighting against this referendum, and created a new organizing committee by saying, in the communities, take groups of 5, groups of 10, organize yourselves, go neighbors, everyone get 10, go off in the communities and organize to defeat this referendum. And people responded. They responded to this call to organize from below, and everywhere in the communities you went, you just saw this self-organization happening in what was called the Comando Maisanta. So that was the third gift, the referendum campaign, because it created much higher, deeper organization in the communities as a result. Okay, so one of the things you find is that every step that the opposition has taken has in fact led to a deepening and advance of the revolutionary process. And one could go back, in fact, to Marx making the comment in his notes on the Paris Commune, which is that slaveholders' revolts, put the sword in the hand of the social revolution, and it advances much more rapidly as a result. And that's been precisely the kind of thing that's happened in Venezuela. Well, what has occurred, since that period, in that period? Well, 2003, after they now had hands on the oil revenue, they were able to change things around. They introduced, for the first time, real significant programs to deal with the enormous social debt, the enormous poverty of Venezuela, dealing first with health programs and also education programs. Barrio Dentro, the Cuban doctors coming into the neighborhood, because of course the Venezuelan doctors who served the oligarchy, who served the elite, the professionals, etc., weren't about to go into the barrios. So you had, now a new program in which, doctors were in every neighborhood, serving people, going to the doctors for the first time. You had new health education programs, literacy programs, programs to allow people to finish grammar school, programs to allow them to prepare them for university. These were new programs. And also, in early 2004, there was also the program of the Mercal. The Mercal was the new government stores, which had their roots in the military opening up the closed supermarkets during the bosses' lockout, and opening it up and making the food available to people. The Mercado became this series of government stores initiated through the military, which then made food available, at very highly subsidized rates, necessities that were subsidized by 50%, et cetera, like that. So that was another mission. And these were extremely important because they were showing to the people that this was a government that meant to change their circumstances, that meant to put an end to the incredible poverty of the country. There was also another mission Volvoncaris, which in many respects reflected a number of the kinds of directions. And Volvoncaris was this new program focusing on both education and work, combining education and work. It was a program which was training people to engage in, to develop skills, and that was one aspect of the training. But the other aspect was in the principles of cooperation. Training people for engaging, creating cooperatives. So graduates of Volvoncaris would go off, they would into cooperatives. Now, a very substantial portion of these were in agricultural cooperatives because, Venezuela is one of those countries with rich soil, monopolized land, and imports 70% of its food. So that the idea of food sovereignty became extremely important. So Volvoncaris emphasized creating people with skills to engage in agricultural production who would then be in cooperatives to do so. And the theme was combining education and work, and that has been a theme that has continued there. And this is at the very time, while these processes were happening, that Chavez began to, in 2003, attack what he called the perverse logic of capital. And in contrast to the perverse logic of capital, he was talking about the importance of the social economy. The social economy now increasingly at this point now is seen not as this little sort of add-on to a capitalist development, a means of survival for those who are having the greatest difficulty in surviving in a neoliberal, capitalist society, but increasingly seen as the alternative. And in 2003, he talked on one of his Alla Presidentes, this was the national educational seminar that he runs. He talked about this, the social economy, he said, bases its logic on the human being. It bases its logic on work, that is to say, on the worker and the worker's family, that is to say, on the human being. And he continued and said, the social economy is not focused on economic gain, it's not focused on exchange value, it generates mainly use values. This is 2003, and he says its purpose is the construction of the new man, the new woman, the new society. Well, it's not a big leap from that description of the social economy to talk about socialism. It's just changing the name of what you were talking about. It's an important ideological, leap to say we're talking about socialism now, but it's not, the content hasn't really changed when he starts saying we have to reinvent socialism at the World Social Forum. Well, there were a number of new elements that were added in 2005. One of the things, one of the most interesting, intriguing elements that some of you may sort of, your mouths may drop, if you haven't seen my description of it here, is that Chavez spent his nights, he's a voracious reader. He reads everything, and he doesn't sleep at night. He sometimes takes naps in the afternoon to revive, but he reads, and he doesn't read like detective stories. He reads Istvan Matsaros' Beyond Capital, the 1,000-page book that he gave as a present to Chavez, to Fidel, and he laughed at one speech that he said, Fidel's really angry at me for giving him such a fat book. Well, Chavez not only was reading it, he was understanding it. And so at one point, he, in one of his Alla Presidentes, he says, let me tell you about this new idea I have. And I'm going to read you my notes from 2 months ago. And he reads his notes from May 18th, I think it was 2005. And he says, and he's drawing on Matsaros' discussion of Marx's Grundriss. And in this discussion, Matsaros talks about, you have to have social labor from the outset. You can't have social labor as a result of an exchange process. There has to be production for communal needs and communal purposes. And Maceros talks about this and talks about this whole thing and says this is the Archimedes, lever on which, of the whole concept of a new society. Chavez says, yes, the Archimedes lever, give me that lever, I will move the world. And he proceeds to talk about the whole necessity at that point to create a new communal system of production and consumption in which exchange of activities is based on communal needs and purposes. And out of that, emerges a new, institutional form called the Empresas de Producción Social, companies of social production. And the logic of the companies of social production was that they would be companies which would orient themselves toward, worker participation and also meeting the needs of society. And they were meant to redirect the activity of cooperatives, and also redirect the activity of private capitalist firms to get them to commit to meeting, communal needs and get them to meet, to change the situation in which their workers worked. Another building block was introduced in 2006, and that was the communal councils. And the communal councils are extremely important. Communal councils was a concept, we can talk about later where it comes from, but it comes from Venezuela. It's a Venezuelan product. Councils based on 200 to 400 families, and these councils would have general assemblies and select their spokespersons, voceros. They're not delegates. They're not representatives. They're spokespersons, voceros. They speak for the community, but they better speak for the community. And the logic of this was that these communal councils would incorporate a number of the existing institutions that were there, like the land committees, like the health committees of the communities, like the defense committees of the communities. All of them were brought together so these communities would now, instead of having limited sectoral visions, they would think about all the needs of their communities together. And these communities would begin the process of engaging in local planning. And participatory budgeting. Now, one thing to note is the contrast between this and a similar concept of participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre, Rosario, and a few other places, because they don't compare in terms of the size. This is 200 to 400 families, 1,000 people. Everyone knows your neighbor, kind of thing, presumably. In some cases, these councils are one building. And so these communal councils were seen as a very important, new step. December 2006, Chavez is reelected, very substantially. Not the 10,000 votes that was madly, aimed at, but 7 million. 10 million votes, 7 million. But important is it was a campaign explicitly based on building socialism. There was, there was no question of what this election meant. And what's happened since? Well, one of the key things that's happened since is what has been called the 5 motors of socialism. Everywhere you go, you see the 5-pointed star. And the 5 motors of socialism are, first of all, the enabling laws, which give Chavez the ability, to enact legislation, introduce legislation in a few areas for a limited time period. This is a long Venezuelan tradition. Previous presidents had it. Chavez had it, and used it in 2002. That's one. 2, constitutional change, being a second motor. 3, morale y luce, which is basically morality and enlightenment, or you could translate it as education and ideology. And a 4th motor is changing the geometry of the country, which is to say changing the geographical subdivision, political subdivisions. I mean, it's madness when you have some parochias, parishes, which are like thousands and millions of people, and then some are little tiny things, and they both have equal governing power. So it's changing those kinds of things. And then the 5th is the explosion of communal power. The 2 key motors, I would suggest, that indicate where the process is going is the 3rd motor, morale y luce, which is because it's a focus on spreading new values, spreading values which emphasize solidarity, critical of the focus on self-interest, and it's also an emphasis on education. Education everywhere is part of the theme of Morality. So including education in workplaces. Education in workplaces to learn the skills of self-management, something that never happened really in Yugoslavia, where even 20 years after they thought this would be accomplished, there was this process in which you still had the experts very clearly able to know the workers in the workers' councils, etc. So education everywhere is a very important element of Morality. And then the other key motor is the explosion of communal power. And the whole idea of the explosion of communal power is building on the communal councils as the cell of a new state. I mean, that's the concept of it. And Chavez has been very explicit on this, and he couldn't be more explicit than when he says, all power to the communal councils. It's the logic of this is going to be the base on which we build. Linking communal councils, to create larger units, planning democracy from below. These two sides complement each other very significantly. The idea of ideology on the one hand and the idea of practice on the other hand. Because if you only have morality, only the practice, but without doing something about changing the values, then you would have a practice focusing on human needs, on local needs, which are the needs generated within a capitalist society. So that's the ideological aspect of this is very critical, but so also is the practice element. Because if you just talk new values, talk selflessness, etc., like that, but don't give people the opportunity to develop and see for themselves the process, then what you have ultimately is a combination of commandism and cynicism. Commandism at the top, cynicism, at the bottom, where people say nothing really changes. So those two complement each other. And it's a focus not only in the communities, this idea of practice there, but also in workplaces. That's being talked about. There's nothing, explicit, in the motors at this particular point, although there's been a rumored sixth motor coming, but it hasn't, it was supposed to be announced about a month ago. I predicted it wouldn't be announced, and it wasn't, and it's, they're still struggling over these questions at this particular point. But Chavez has been very explicit. From starting in January, he started talking about what he called the elementary triangle. And the elementary triangle is social property, in which there is social production organized by workers for the purpose of communal needs and purposes. So social property, social production, communal needs and purposes. And one of the key elements in this focus is on the idea of social property. Now, much of all this is all in the realm of the battle of ideas. But there are real changes happening as well. And people will hear about those. There's been an enormous expansion of the state sector happening. Both because some of the state industries are expanding, industries such as the oil industry, but also the petrochemical industry. Processing that oil is expanding significantly. Basic industry is expanding. But in addition to the expansion, because of money being pumped into those sectors, and imports of machinery coming in through a lot of connections that the government is making with state companies elsewhere, in China, in Iran, well, those are the two that come to mind immediately. There's also the nationalization of strategic sectors that's been happening. So nationalization of the communication sector, the major CAN TV, nationalization of the electric power company. And some people say this is not really nationalization, because nationalization really is when you take it and don't give any compensation. Look, the point is, it's now state-owned. The state can make its decisions based on its ownership of these things. It's paid market prices for them. Of course, the market price went down a little as soon as the announcement of nationalization happened, and so that, anyway. So, also, the state has retrieved the dominant position within the heavy oil sector, which had been completely dominated by the multinationals. And furthermore, there have been growing attacks and reclaiming of land of the latifundias and land distribution Venezuela is one of the most uneven in Latin America. And most recently, there has been, the democratization of the media by the reversion of the channel RCTV to the public sector, where it's being run as a public information channel. Let me stress one point, which is that the pace at which these things happen is absolutely incredible. You sort of wake up, if you're away for a week, you sort of like, things have changed enormously. New things are announced constantly, et cetera. And last night, for example, as I was driving to the airport, Chavez was on radio, but maybe on television, probably on television too, talking about introduction of planning within the economy, planning by sectors. And the establishment of a new commission, new presidential commission, which would organize the planning process, by 4 different sectors of the economy. And finally, let me just note, in terms of things that are happening right at this moment, is the organization of the new Unified Socialist Party. And this is, a very significant, development, because for one, Chavez is moving away from these parties in which, you had this constant rivalry, between the different Chavez parties. I mean, first of all, we're really talking about 3 dominant parties in the Chavez grouping, but the Communist Party was increasingly important, as part of this coalition. The situation, that was existing was the Quinta Republica, the dominant, party, had about, one person once told me there were 12 factions, but there are at least 3 or 4 factions which absolutely hate each other, constantly battling. And then there were the other 2, major, Chavez parties, and all of them were sort of, competing constantly. Well, Chavez had said last year, or I think it was June, saying we have to create a unified socialist party, a single party, and stop all this, nonsense that's going on here. So came the election, and the Quinta Republica, which was uniquely placed, in the prime, sort of position on the ballots. So anyone who wanted quickly to vote for Chavez would vote under the Quinta Republica rather than the other 15 or so Chavez parties. And so the dominant, overwhelming, votes for Chavez came on this Quinta Republica's slate. So the immediate response in the Quinta Republica was, well, we are the dominant. We are the single party. Those others should join us. And that was, without question, the dominant view within the leadership of the Quinta Republica. Chavez gave this incredible speech, and I wrote an article that was on the MR Zine called "It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want to." His speech, which brought together a lot of the activists who had actually been involved in the campaign, both the activists in the sort of day-to-day work, but also a lot of the high party activists, and he brought them all together in a big auditorium, and he said, we have to create this party, and it's not going to be a fusion of the existing parties. It's going to be an entirely new kind of party. It's going to be a party built from the bottom. It's going to, you will build it from the bottom, and you will, you know who are the drunks and who are the corrupt people and who are the people who are not really, part of this process. You will choose your own leaders, etc., like that. And I was watching this, and I was saying, I said in the high-priced seats they were not very happy, but in the back they were cheering, and basically said, if the people here, after this process, are the same faces, then we will have been deceitful to the people. And he clearly was saying we have to build this new kind of party, a party based from below, etc. And that's been one of the major processes that's been happening right now. Now, in the article I wrote for the July monthly review issue, I said, well, they probably won't, unlikely they'll get to 4 million that they're, looking for, that some people have been looking for. It was pretty far, because they got 7 million votes, in the election. To think that they're going to get 4 million people to sign up in the party, is sort of kind of incredible. The last count I had a couple days ago, 5.3 million. Anyway. Don't clap. There are some problems in those numbers. And some of those numbers are inflated because people are being told, you really have to sign up, you better sign up. So there's a lot of, and this is not coming from the top, but it's coming from keeners in the middle and the bottom who want, let's say, everyone in their workplace to be signed up, et cetera, like that. So how many of this 5.3 million are really going to be around, a long way down, there? It's unclear. But still, the fact is that this is no tiny little party. It's certainly not the cadre party, that the Communist Party was arguing had to be, the basis for carrying on to socialism. As a result of which, like some of the other parties that have stayed, leading parties that have stayed out of